thank you all for joining us today. This is our Future Directions Forum for 2022. I'm really excited about today's topic. So a few of you last year let us know that you really want to see some workshops on use of participatory action frameworks. And so, we actually have two of these workshops on these topics. This is the first of the two, and later on in the next few weeks, we'll be announcing when we'll hold the workshop for a related workshop on the intersection between use of participatory action frameworks and fulfilling NIH's funding priorities. And then, so I think this is a great opportunity for us to sort of think about, all the strategies one must consider before sort of seeking out, these kinds of funding priorities. It's one thing to propose a really good research study, and quite another to ensure that whatever you're proposing is something you can actually do. Who better to sort of talk about these things than a couple of colleagues of mine who've had a great deal of experience working on issues surrounding use of participatory action frameworks within the context of some really innovative, research and practice programs. So without further ado, Judith Scott, Yoyo, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to start out with a PowerPoint, and then eventually we'll take it away because I do not like not seeing people. Okay. So this is okay. We're doing community-based participatory research, and I'm doing this with Yoyo, who's from Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center in Boston, and I'm Judith Scott, and I'm from Boston University School of Social Work. So we're just going to start kind of thinking about a quick icebreaker, kind of a word or two from you in the chat, and then making sure that we're all on the same page regarding participatory frameworks. And then we're going to actually, Yoyo and I have a conversation in which we'll talk a lot about how do we navigate these kind of partnerships, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So if you could put this in the chat, when you think about the word community-based participatory research, what words come to mind? Oops, sorry. Difficult, yes. They are not easy. They take a lot of work. Any other words? Sharing, yes, a lot of sharing. It is exciting when it happens. It's kind of a thrill, right? Okay. So CVPR, I'm sure that some of you have some background in it or some knowledge of it, but I think it's important to establish a shared language when talking about something, especially because I feel like CVPR has been used to describe different types of partnerships that actually are not participatory in nature. And so it's important for us to make sure that we know what we're coming from. So the foundation of CVPR is based in two different people, one of them being Kurt Lewin, who actually coined the term action research in 1946. And in this, he basically stated that there was a huge gap between theory and research, and that we really needed to make sure that our research was leading to some sort of action to solve some problems in the actual world. So he felt like that we should really think about how do we address social issues and not just doing research for research's sake. Paulo Freire, of course, is well known. He brings that education must begin with the solution of the teacher-student contradiction by reconciling the poles of the contradiction so that both are simultaneously teachers and students. And in so that quote, he really challenges the way that we think about knowledge. And when we're in different spaces, we think of the students or the people listening as the ones who are repositories of knowledge, and we are the ones that provide it. But actually, it's both a learning and teaching that should be happening when we think about knowledge. And because of this idea that some people have the right to provide knowledge and some only to receive it, that really reinforces the way that we think about oppression. So Ferrari really thought about how can we help communities and individuals really critically reflect on their realities and their social realities, and really emphasize, along with Lewin, that the meaning that people make of their context and of different issues are extremely important and need to be considered. And that it was important to ensure that there were voices for those who would be otherwise oppressed by the way that knowledge is thought about in our world. So there are underlying assumptions of CBPR. Something that we need to acknowledge straight up is that researchers like higher education and other institutions are steeped in the legacy of white supremacy culture. It's a place where that holds the gatekeeping of knowledge. And if you think about trying to access all those academic journals, you have to pay for it. So it also plays into capitalism. But CBPR is more about redistributing that power and resources, ensuring that all that participate have that all are learning in this process, and that the key thing is that there are actions that's working to promote equity. When working with communities, it's easy to say that their communities are complex and adaptive. This may seem like, well, yes, Judith, of course they're complex and adaptive. But why this matters is that it could be that at one moment a community is ready to do work, and another minute something has changed in the community, whether it be resources, funding, a stakeholder, exactly. There's constantly evolving. And so that's something to consider, that communities are sort of a living entity. And you're needing to kind of check in on a regular basis to understand what is the flow, what is the balance, who are the people that really help shape everything, how do the residents actually transact with their context, and vice versa. So the key to this in thinking about defining CBPR is it's a collaborative approach to research that works on having all partners working equitably in the research process and really recognizing each strengths that are there, and with the aim of providing some sort of change, social change that's to be eliminated, such as health disparities. There's this joke that actually my colleagues shared about a man who's dropped his keys in the middle of the dark parking lot. He moves some distance over and he starts searching for it under a bright light. And when asked why not looking where he was actually dropped them, he said, this is because this is where the light is. So oftentimes you find in research that we're looking at causes, at correlations, at connections that actually aren't the root of the problem, that it's actually something else that we need to be looking at, and we're looking at it in the wrong direction. So something that really helps in CBPR is ensuring that all the stakeholders are helping to kind of shape the way that studies are, and helping to ensure that we're looking at what are the actual causes, and not just thinking about what is theoretically we think is right, or asking questions that have no action tied to them. So this picture is actually an example of the spectrum, the spectrum that we can see of CBPR. The way that we usually see people operate traditionally, which are taught about in higher ed, is sort of the helicopter science, right? Where the communities do not have any influence on the research. They're simply there to help, engage around recruitment, but they don't shape the study. They don't have any part of it. They don't have part of the funding. And so this is where we see that people will call CBPR work in which they just simply ask for recruitment or ask them to sign something and never ask them to participate in the whole process. To be truly CBPR, it needs to be that at every stage of the research process, it is an equal partnership and people are actually talking with each other about every single part of it. And there should be no part where one partner has more power than the other to make decisions, but instead it's made at a table together and it's an agreement. The key thing to remember is that CBPR is not just a research method. There's been a lot of focus on people using community-based approaches in order to do their research, but the key part is it has to take action, right? And it has to be some way addressing some sort of social justice. So somebody mentioned in the chat that it could be difficult work, right? Why partner? I mean, one, I will say I love my partners, Yoyo, you rock. But also in thinking about the fact that the data you get are very much situated in the context of the phenomenon that you're exploring, and being able to get the different perspectives on something, because there's never one truth or one perspective, right? So as many perspectives you can get, you're able to have more of a holistic understanding of the data that's actually there. Oftentimes we try to do work with different populations that are not our own. And by partnering with people who have the expertise, it enables to make sure that we're collecting the data the right way and asking the right questions. Another thing is that we think about dissemination in terms of posters and academic papers, which I joke all the time that if somebody reads my paper in the next 5 years, that's thrilling. But obviously that kind of timetable doesn't really get you to action. So the way that, you know, community organizations work in being able to use dissemination and to leverage that information and funding toward policy changes is what actually helps move things a lot faster than you would on your own as an academic. And lastly, it's changing the systems and reducing barriers, but also developing levels of trust to be able to work with each other, to be able to recruit and work with the population. That is the focus of the studies. So I put this up here not for us to walk through every single one, but just for you to kind of glance for, and you'll hear these kind of phrases pop up in our conversation: strength-based, community, co-learning, balances, sustainability, and cultural humility. There are various challenges that come in play when thinking about community engaged work. Part of it is time, right? We all know now, like, especially after COVID, like, time is like fleeting and there's such a sense of urgency about everything. But what is urgent for one is not necessarily urgent for the other. Thinking about the power differentials and issues of control, right? So for us to feel comfortable with doing the research, oftentimes we're encouraged to take control of that. We get rewarded for being principal investigators and things like that. But the reality is that that's actually not going to be conducive to working in this situation. Building trust can be really scary, but important to the process. Navigating culture, academic culture, which we'll get to a little bit later. Thinking about what is credibility and what is expertise. There's in our culture a focus on the written word when there's so much expertise built into the voices and the experiences of many different people. So how do we ensure that their voices are what's being raised and not just our own being brought into them or co-opting their knowledge? And also thinking about, like, how do we think about inclusion and communication? I think we're encouraged in academia to focus on individualism because it's easier to do work by yourself when you don't have to make decisions with others. But once again, is that really leading to the best research? Is that leading to the best solutions around addressing health disparities? Not necessarily. And so lastly, thinking about, you know, financial resources, and we're going to mention some other challenges as well.
Okay, so I guess we get a base framework about the CBPR research. Now we are going to move into a conversations between community partners and a researcher. So in this conversations, I will ask Judith some questions and Judith will ask me some questions as well. So Judith, you ready? Let's start at the first questions.
Well, not yet, not yet.
Oh, okay.
We're excited about the conversation.
Okay. So here is one of the research project we recently, okay, Judith, you want to talk about this research? I talk the next one?
Yeah. Okay. So our partnership started actually when Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, also known as BCNC, was looking for a program evaluation, and I got somehow on the email and I responded right as I was about to begin my position as assistant professor. I didn't have an office yet, but I was like, we will do this. So for 2 years, we worked together on an agency and program evaluation, really getting to know each other. And for me, it was my first time working with this community and getting to really understand the experiences of Chinese immigrant families. Around the 2-year point, we were both all thinking about maybe doing research together. But we hadn't quite voiced it yet. And then a grant proposal came up. And I was about to ask the ED, who at the time was Giles Lee. And then Giles was like, I really want to meet with you about something. I'm like, okay. So he met with me and he's like, I want us to do research. And I'm like, are you reading my mind? So it was a serendipitous moment that led to this actual study right here, which is focused on thinking about what does parenting look like among Chinese immigrant caregivers with low incomes in the Boston area. there is a scarcity of voices around the experiences of Chinese immigrant caregivers, which could include parents and grandparents, in the literature, which primarily focuses on upper and middle class, mostly due to the model minority myth. And so we really asked them questions about, what is it that, how do they conceptualize supportive parenting, harsh parenting, abusive, and in what ways does context affect their parenting? And lastly, what do they want service providers to know about helping them support themselves and their children? So you can see here, this is the pictures of the team that were actually there. Along with Yoyo and Giles, we actually had other members of the community that were part of other organizations that participated in the research at every stage. And so this was our first partnership, and now Yoyo will talk about our current one.
Thank you, Judith. So the current one is to support Asian parents and children talk about race and racism. As you all know, during the pandemic, anti-Asian racism is on the rise. But we all know racism in the society have been a long time. And I think the pandemic just put the forefront attentions on AAPI. So one of the things we learned that during the pandemic, Asian families are very hesitant to go out. And I even had a family say to me that if I could have a choice, I would not send children to school because I don't feel safe for my child to attend during the pandemic. So there's a lot of stress in the family. But we also learned that sometimes parents want to protect children and just keep them isolated from the society in order to protect their care about safety. But however, they might not have the language or capacity to understand how to talk to the child about racism. So during the conversations with Dr. Wookie from South Cole Community Health Center, as well as she is a professor at William James, Judith, Scott, and myself are really curious about this topic and how we could understand Asian parents and children talk about race and racism. So that's the research project has been created. So we bring a team of other people in these conversations. And fortunately, we received a grant from BU as well as William James College. Yeah, so we could to study this research. And I could not believe that we back and forward, I get the documentations ready for ILB. We are still in the process to get approval, but we are more comfortable where we are now. Yeah, Judith, want to add anything?
No, you summed it up perfectly. So yes, now let us converse. The conversation is just going to talk about just generally thinking about how do we select partners, not just for each other, but for other projects that we're in. How do you develop equitable partnerships? How do we address the challenges and the systems that we're in, but as well as acknowledging the strengths? What is it like developing a research study proposal where you may have different language or different needs or priorities? The implementation of the study, yeah, you get funding, now what? Which is the stage we're in right now. And then thinking about meaningful dissemination. So I'm going to stop sharing because we don't need to look at the slides all the time. And now, Yoyo, yes.
Yes. Yeah, so now we move to a conversations between partnership, community-based organizations and researcher Judith Scott. So let me start our first questions. I'm going to ask Judith. And Judith, what are the criteria for you selecting a community organizations to partner with?
So the first thing that I tend to do is I make a spreadsheet. So I really like spreadsheets, and I use those spreadsheets to collect as many different organizations as I can to see what their impact is. And I always try to see if I have at least one person I know of who is knowledgeable about that community and is then able to tell me something about which are the organizations that are really key stakeholders in the community. And that would be somebody who's interested in partnership, right? Because they could be a key stakeholder and be like, we're good, we don't need your support. The other thing that I think about is what are existing works or research that community organizations are already doing to see if maybe I can help in there, because for me, one of my biggest fears is trying to reinvent a wheel that's already being developed by other organizations. Something else that I think about is when I meet someone is their interest in the topic. So for me, I'm very aware of the history that is behind being an academic, the times we've exploited communities, and ask questions, use the data in ways that were not helpful to the community. And so when I walk into a room or I talk or I connect to any organization, that history is very much something that's on my shoulder when I'm contacting them. So I prefer to contact them with somebody who they're known of, and as well as ensuring that they know something that I've offered organizations, which Yoyo doesn't know, is I'm like, do you want to talk to BCNC? Because like they can tell you honestly how I operate, because you really never know. And as having been somebody who has been in a community organization and working in one, I've seen the ways that academics unintentionally can cause harm. And so in all of this, I think about that. And then lastly, capacity, time, and what their role is. And judging and determining whether that's something that they can do. I said lastly, but that's not true. The last thing is actually, do they have a sense of humor? Because if we're going to spend a lot of time together and you can't laugh with me or have a conversation, it's not going to work very well. So Yoyo, how do you decide who you're going to partner with?
So from a community-based perspective, I would say the first, I will assess the researchers' intentions, like why they approach these organizations, and what is their intentions, what is their timeline, what is the ultimate goal they want to achieve. So if someone told me that I'm interested to research on this topic, for example, parenting, but my goal is want to lift up the community voice, or I want other voice to be here from the community. So, and then I will ask more questions whether the researchers' value is alignment with the organization's visions and missions. And very often in the community, I hear people say, oh, researcher coming in to interview us, and then after 1 or 2 years, the research report be have a publications, but it's never returned back to the community. So sometimes community members feel like they be used as a research subject of the study, but never have any impact in the community. So I'm very mindful when I select a researcher in the partnership of research. And the other elements is very important for people interested to partner with community-based organizations. A lot of time, community-based organizations, they hire people from the community and want to serve the community. So you have to be very mindful of their time commitment, even though they really want to do it, but they might not have enough capacity to support engage in every aspect of the research. So I think it's very important to communicate upfront how much commitment they could commit it, and what is the process could support each other in the research. A lot of time, community-based organizations just don't want to be used as an outreach tool, because on and off a researcher will approach us, oh, can you outreach recruit this X number of participants, we want them to participate in this research. Very often community-based will feel like you use us to help you recruit, but it's never applied to a actionable outcome. The bottom line is a community-based organization really want to lift up the voice in the community, especially for marginalized community and underserved community. Yeah.
Something I was thinking about as you were talking was like, how do you define community can be the hardest part of determining this. You may think that you have found the people who are the stakeholders, then someone else was like, how could you have left so-and-so out of the mix? So it's like there's a lot of talking that has to happen, and checking in with people to understand like who should be at the table and like who's not actually here. And you don't want to step on any toes, because if you forget anybody who would be interested and really involved, then who knows how that's going to look for like the actual like study.
Yeah, that is very good point, Judith. I think sometimes when researcher identify a community, it's not necessary the community-based organization have the same point of view of the community. So it's better talk it out loud and talk it through. And through that brainstorming process, sometimes we might invite more people at the table to be more meaningful conversations. Yeah. Yeah, so the next questions I have you is, Judith, how do you determine if the partnership will be equitable?
So I try to be as transparent as possible about where I'm coming from. So I'm an assistant professor, I'm on tenure track. What that means is that there are certain expectations that I must achieve during that research. And I'm very upfront about that with my partners, so they understand sometimes why I might be like leaning towards something as something else. But I also believe that it's important to bring in partners from the very beginning. So if I have a concept or idea, right, I need to go pitch it to community organization before I even think about, is this something I write up? Is this something I actually propose? I feel like at that point, if the grant is already created, right, the power is already lost because they had no way to shape what was being asked and to make sure that it's actually relevant. Something that I also check in on about is ensuring that the partners feel like what is being discussed is important. So for example, I was pursuing a grant proposal and I was thinking about sort of the effects of structural racism on Black youth and mental health, but I wasn't sure if I was asking the right questions. And so we reached out to 30 different organizations, 11 responded, woo! And so when I met with them, it was very upfront about like, this is my agenda, like this is my profile if you want to know who it is. I sent them some papers just to know who I am. And then I said, I'd like to have a conversation with you about this topic and whether you think it's interesting. And also it's an invitation to do research with me if you're interested in that. For their time, I also paid them for it. So from the beginning, I showed that I really valued what they were doing and provided them with a gift card. So if they chose not to participate, they still knew that I valued what their perspective was. The tool that I tend to use with organizations when we're moving closer to thinking about a collaboration is an MOU. So I will actually draft up a memorandum and I say like, this is the goal of the study. This is what, the responsibilities would be. What are the responsibilities that you take that you believe are yours and what are the responsibilities for mine? I also think it's important to be very clear about data sharing and publication dissemination. So who actually owns the data? How will it be used? What say do all the different partners have on that? And ensuring that there are roles available for people to do dissemination. So I tend to have that template out just to start from a place where everything's written out there. And if anything goes wrong, we can kind of go back to that. So that's my start when I'm thinking about equitable. What about you?
So I'm thinking about the equitable could be all the lens for the level of engagement. And just like you say, Judith, when you have an idea, you already knock on the door of a community-based organizations to where the stakeholder will be interested, rather than you already have a concrete idea or receive funding and knock people's door, and people will feel it's not being included in the early on. So that will really jeopardize the process about the trust. So I think that is the first lens. If we're thinking about equitable in the lens of a level of engagement, and then at the same time, community organizations and academia have different resources and different knowledge on different things. I think equal share and sometimes for some other community-based organization having less resources, we need to delegate more funding and more resources in order for them have a capacity to participate. So I think it's a dynamic, it's flexible, and adaptable. So we need to use the equitable lens when we fill out the level of engagement.
Yeah. Something I was also thinking about is sort of the need for funding and determining that during grants. So recently I was kind of working on a grant with these organizations who were interested, and I put the budget out there and I said, like, you're going to wonder where the money went. Like the money went to Fringe, the money went to this, but also what would you want to be paid for this work? Which I think we don't really ask that question enough. And sometimes organizations are like, whatever you want, which actually for me, I don't take as a yes, because I feel like it's important for them to feel like their work is valued. So that really helps with that equability. And actually that's what we did for BCMC. It was like, how much do you want? No, seriously, how much do you want? And so then, we decided on that actual amount. The other thing that you were talking about, leveraging resources is that I always ask in what way I can help the organization. So it's not just about, this one-time thing, but more of an investment. So I will ask if there are events that I can participate in, any kind of committees. So actually for BCNC, I'm on their program committee, which is a committee in which they use to kind of think about solutions outside the box for the different challenges that are facing programs in the agency. And I've been doing that now, I think, for 3 years. So it's not just a short-term thing, you know, it's a show of I'm not going anywhere, and like this is something that we're doing it together. And I think that makes it more of a give and take in that process. I, however, do not ask for compensation because it's a completely different role. And I think it's important to not only just be working with people, but to understand where they're coming from. Like, I think the best thing I could have done, for example, with you for BCNC Yoyo was do that program evaluation. I learned every aspect of that agency. And that's where I really developed this interest in like, what's going on for parenting in this population.
Yeah, Judith, by listening to you, I already have the other example as a community-based organization. So we feel what value for us. And a few years ago, a pediatric MD, she's very interested understand children with autism. So she really want to conduct that study. But we all know that is the area of taboo. No people want to talk about autism, and because most of parents believe, oh, they will grow out of it. They don't have a worry. This is very early on diagnosis, like when the child was around 3 years old. So what she did is she said, Yoyo, I really want get this message across the immigrant populations, especially Chinese populations. So what she did is she volunteered herself to provide a series workshops about when you have a child visit pediatric, here's what questions you need to ask the pediatrics to get a mindset, make sure your child is match the developmental goal, and some area may be culturally different, so how you should navigate. So throughout the series of workshops, she really built a relationship with parents. So when she launched that research project, people are well received. People want to participate. People even ask her, like, when you're going to do it. So her intentions is she want to giving back to the community. It's not like just take, but it's giving and take. So I think that respect, it really helped her to build the trust to the community and in the community. Yeah. So that was a very good example, Judith. You remind me, like giving and receiving at the same time. And the other area I'm thinking about is the systems, right? Like community-based organizations have a system, academia have a systems. So Judith, can you talk about the pros and cons in academic systems?
So something you should know is that like one of the reasons I wanted to enter academia was precisely to be able to leverage resources for community organizations. Having been a staff member at one and working and not getting as much and seeing what was available, that was a motivation for me. The thing is that like so community-based has become sort of the buzzword that exists in academia. And it's welcome when people see things like community-based research, but the mechanisms have not quite been developed to ensure that there is equal partnership between community organizations and researchers. So for example, we'll talk a little bit about our IRB process. We were just working in the IRB process, and the part of that is needing to sign a financial disclosure form. BU required that for that to happen, that Yoyo and other staff member and people outside the organization would have a BU login. So then we had to create the BU login, which then didn't work, right? So then 3 weeks later of trying to figure this out, I finally get to this point where I'm like, you have now wasted my partner's time. Just send a PDF. Can we just do it that way, right? And then I ended up having a conversation with them about like what is actually needed to help community partners. Another example is that like organization like academia is really used to paying within and not paying out. And so when you say, okay, I'm going to have this organization and they're going to be asking for their money, the time it takes to do that is so much slower. So I have a colleague at a different university who has a partner, and she's like, they haven't been paid since April because literally the university doesn't know how to maneuver its way in the pay system to pay the partners, right? So these are, I think, some of the challenges. And another one is that, you know, for this study we have now, Yoyo and Catherine, Dr. Vudke, they're also co-PIs. So for me, that was like important, right? If you're going to be doing participatory work, like we should all have the same title, right? But when I was applying for funding, there was no space to put them as that, right? So it's a tricky thing to have to push against your system, who wants this research but doesn't have the mechanisms to welcome that research, and to do this and to have to think about that. So a lot of time can be spent on making sure people get paid. So our last study, I was like constantly talking to the grant, like, send the check, why do you still have the money? I don't want the money. Let them give them the money. So there's a lot of work that goes to that extra and making sure there's communication that's happening and doing that. And the other thing I think about is the creation of knowledge. So for academia, like the way that you do that is through academic papers, which honestly are rarely of use to community organizations. Occasionally they may be, but we put a paywall behind a paywall. So how would they even know? So in having to write academic papers, right, if you think about, well, if you want your community partners to be partnered on this, how does that work out equitably, considering they're not getting necessarily paid for dissemination, and they clearly have their own full-time job. So working with different organizations about that on dissemination can be really difficult. What are the pros? The pros are academia is a lot of resources, a lot of resources. So I happily enjoy, if I find any kind of funding opportunities that can go to my partners, I share that, right? If there are any kind of articles that I know are relevant or I hear of anything, I share that. If I could connect them to a colleague that is trustworthy and only trustworthy colleagues, I will do that. So there are a lot of ways and also mechanisms now that are being created that support this participatory research that I will happily let them know about that. So I know that the pros and cons of my system are very different for me, but like as a community organization, like what are the pros and cons for you?
Yeah, Judith, you really walk the talk. So I could be truly testify, like last 5 years, you definitely share a lot of resources to the community, as well as like, to me, like what will be the benefit for the community. I really appreciate that. And for the community-based organizations, as Judith say, I will talk about the con first. Most of our staff have a full-time job, and then most of the job is related to grant fundings or the government funding. So they have a set of the scope of work take up all their time, like 9 to 5, 5 days per week. So when I approach my staff, say, hey, this research is very meaningful, we're uplifting to the community, and are usually alignment with our visions and missions of the organizations. So to help the staff to see why they have to do extra work, why they have to connect these constituents to this research project. So so it's the limitations about the staff capacity, but also sometimes we don't have a space. Let's say if a Judith want to interview or run a focus group for our constituents, sometimes we might not have enough space to address that. And sometimes our parents also struggling on their busy schedule. So we have to communicate with academia, say, hey, you cannot run the focus group 9 to 5 because that's the parents working, and you have to come in like from 7 to 9 p.m. and usually have to do it on Friday because the parent don't have to worry about the next day send their kid go to school, stuff like that. So it's a lot of communications and back and forward, and that's the knowledge community-based organizations have. And usually we communicate upfront to the academias when you want to conduct the research. Here is the boundary you need to think about. Here is the limitations you need to consider. And for the polls is, I think, community-based organizations, especially the staff, spend a lot of time in the community to build relationship, helping the constituents to navigate the community resources and or navigate the systems. So the trust is very solid in there. So most of the time, our staff don't want to break the trust, so they will assess their risk as well too. So I remember 2 years ago when a researcher approached us on a gambling research. So we say it very clearly, say, hey, if you ask these questions in a community, no one is going to answer you because they say, okay, you really ask people the first questions about the problem. People are not going to answer your questions. So I remember that researcher is very respect the community-based knowledge. They go back to IRB to modify the questions and then come back to us, say, hey, we listen to you. Here's the area. We respect your knowledge and skill, and we modify it. So that is very mutual respect in both ends. So we really appreciate on that. And for the community-based organizations, we also have a network like have the partnership with different community organizations, also on the city level, as well as the policy level. We want all this partnership will be meaningful, channel all the way up. And we also want the research outcome will be able to inform policy change, and then will be the best impact for the community. So that is some of the area about networking and cons in the partnership. Yeah, Judith, you want to add anything?
No, you did a really good job. I can't talk from that perspective. I was kind of reflecting about and thinking about, as you're developing this research, how do you balance the different perspectives from funders, from communities and researchers as you develop that question and that study, and also like, how do you build trust while you're doing that?
Yeah, so I think the trust is ongoing process, and I remember like, Judith approached us on this parenting research. We said, okay, let's give it a try, and then later on we learned that that's a divisions of labor. Okay, we don't have a capacity to involve very in-depth level, and I think Judith, you were very mindful, understand that, and then immediately identify or hire research assistants. They're bilingual and bicultural, be able to craft that research and meet the community-based need. And I think that is the beauty of a partnership, Yeah.
I think transparency is critical. As I think Yoyo will contest, I like to tell everybody everything to make sure that everybody's there. What that also means is that we have a Google Share Drive at BU. So all the partners have access to everything. Everything is sort of in one place. So there isn't like just back and forth sending. And if there's anything they want to read, see, or write, that is there technologically there. Like I said, I'm very aware of like capacity and thinking about what can we actually do and what is it that works. For me, trust is when I see that like community organizations are willing to meet me where I'm at in terms of we can't do this, but we can do that, right? Or we can't support this opportunity, but we want you to know about other things going on in our community. It doesn't have to be necessarily what I need, but what they're willing to offer might be acceptable enough. I think the hardest part, like I talked about, is the financial compensation. I wish that we as children learned how to talk about money, like just socially, because it's always a very awkward conversation because nobody wants to provide a figure that's going to like, is this enough, or vice versa. But I also say from the very beginning, like there will be financial compensation and we will discuss that it is. And we talk about what are some things that are just kind of part of the process, right? And what aren't. In this study that we're actually doing, none of us are getting compensated for it because we agreed the money should go to the participants and also to the RAs that we're hiring to do this work. So we made an agreement that that's important. So then in our next grant, then we're hoping that we can get more. I think it's very important to talk about like the different values that we have. Like Yoyo, I was talking to her, I was like, do we have moments where we didn't really get along? We don't have that. But we also have different perspectives where like 1 minute I was like, well, I thought it was this. And I was like, oh, I assumed it was that. So it's very important to raise your assumptions during conversations, because you can go down a path and then realize like, this is actually not what anybody wants. And it can be really problematic. And if there are things that don't work out the way that you think they are, it's so important to be transparent about it. And to be really clear about why that happened. So example, I had to change the budget several times for this last proposal. And I was like, let me explain to you why I changed this budget. Like, why is it that there's less money than we thought it was? Just so they were aware, if they cared about that, it was up to them. And I think lastly, like we focus on as researchers wanting to have like a partner that can fulfill everything that we need. And that sometimes means that smaller organizations are pushed out of being able to do research, even though they may have something really important to contribute. And so I think it's important to talk about the many different roles that everyone can play. It could be that they help with dissemination. It could be that they provide spaces to have workshops or to take that information and leverage it in something else. And so to really think about like, what does this organization need and what can help? So the parenting study that we did was one in which BCNC used the research not only to do, we did some evidence briefs together, but also it helped them look at their parenting stuff and see like, what can we add in that was culturally appropriate, that strengths that we hadn't acknowledged, adding even more in using that research. So like, there are different ways that you can actually do that.
Yeah, Judith, the other example I want to give is like the importance of balanced power of funder, researcher, and community-based organizations. And I remember sometimes when we conduct research, identify some of theme throughout the research, but however, those theme might not necessarily tap into the root cause. So I think it's very important to have the researcher and community-based organizations say, hey, the constituents always answer these questions about Borman. What's that mean about Borman? So when we really look into the root cause, and actually you could tap into determinant of social health, they don't have those elements to access resources. That's why they always feel bored. So I think it's really critical when a researcher identify some material and get stuck and come back to the community, say, hey, we get stuck in here, and can you help me like figure out the root cause of these issues? And I think that's the beauty between researcher and community-based organizations. And then we could inform the funder, say, hey, this is the root cause of the problem. Could you see it? And that also will be a very powerful recommendations to ask for actionable recommendations to inform social policy change too. Yeah.
I think something else that I think sometimes researchers do, and I think also nonprofits, is try to shift themselves enough to fit a funder. Which could mean funding programming that actually is like not sustainable or actually veers off the mission. And then for researchers actually not focusing on the actual issue that started the partnership. So something that we do talk about a lot is like thinking about different funders. So there was one funder which we could apply to it, but we knew that we would get like absolutely no feedback. And so we were like, we want feedback on whatever we do. There was another funder that was saying, we welcome community-based work, but you cannot have a community organization as a PI. And so like I was like, okay, that's like not in the picture, right? So you also have to find funders that in some way align and acknowledge that community organizations are equal and bring expertise that should be valued, and it shouldn't just be like an add-in to something. That can make it harder, but I feel like it's a lot harder when you try to fit something into like a sort of a round thing into a square hole, right? Because then it means everybody has to kind of shape and shift themselves that may not feel authentic to the actual topic or questions you want to ask, and in the end may end up wasting people's time because it's not actually the questions that need to be asked.
Yeah, those are very good points. Thank you for that out, Judith. And let's say if we have a wonderful funder and we receive funding, so what we do next, how do you divide the labor, time, resources to start the project or study?
I mean, this is like an ongoing discussion, right? Because we find, okay, we're going to do this project, and then something happens in the community, right? Some programming needs attention, like COVID did a number in terms of plans around research. And so also, how do people commit? So I remember in the beginning, like asking Yoyo and Catherine, like, how much time can you commit to this? And like, Yoyo was like, I'm not answering that question because it's really hard to do that, right? Because you need to be flexible to like your job. So the way that I'm slowly learning, and you could feel free to be like, no, Judith, that does not work, is I feel that one, making sure that we have like a time when we're connecting pretty regularly. And so I've learned to now schedule like 3 or 4 months in advance, because that way it makes it a lot easier to the people to plan ahead and to be all there at the same time. I think secondly, sometimes some people can't always make it. And that's okay as long as there's like one representative from that person. And then we record the meetings to ensure that people then can watch that on their own time if they wish to, as well as put all the actionable steps in email on a regular basis. Actually, I need to do that this week. Sorry about that, Yoyo. I think another thing is there's a lot of times translating what academia means. So I remember showing, and it can mean different in different places. So for Catherine, for William James College, their IRB is very short. Like I was very jealous. Whereas the BU one is like 30 something pages, right? So showing that, I think, to Yoyo and Catherine and being like, this is what we have to do, help them understand where I was coming from in terms of making these asks that seem like, why do you need all this information? And things like that. And I think also, even in hiring research, so I recently am, actually, I'm almost done hiring 2 research assistants and possibly getting 2 more for this project. And I actually didn't know what to do. Like I wanted Yoyo and Catherine to be involved in it, but they also gave me more meetings. And so sometimes I just things that I just take on because it's, you know, more of my job. I have more capacity to do that and then report back. And so figuring out what you need partners to do and what you can do and then report back, I feel like is really important. And developing sort of norms around communication and ensuring responsibility, like we have a sheet that tracks all that, I think really helps, but it's hard.
It is. And Judith, it is, if you ask me how much hour I could commit per week, it's very scary things. Because when I look at my calendar, I could not even find half an hour, you know, to log in sometimes. And I think just like at the beginning, echo back is like community-based organizations, people have their own full-time job. So research is kind of like add on. But I do want to say it's more dynamic. So I might have 1 week, very intensive week. I don't even have like 1 hour to meet with Judith, but maybe next week I have a 2 hour I'm available. So I think because we've been in partnership for a while, we have a trust there. So we, just like Judith said, sometimes if they are not available, they might not show up on that week. That's okay. But you know, the trust is there. The next week they will bounce back and they might work off the line without meeting, but they will commit the work, get the work done. So I think that's critical.
I think the key point in this is that like nobody's world is static, right? So we could all be like, we're gonna do this, and then like something arrives and it's like, I can't do this right now. And having to find a way to be flexible, and not only being flexible, but communicating that to the funder. So, you know, we hit some snags because we thought some things were translated in certain languages and that was going to take time. And so we communicated exactly, you know, to the funder, these are the things that are going on. So I think that that's also an important part of it, is seeing where you have some wiggle room and acknowledging that different priorities, different responsibilities that are the primary ones for community organizations, and the research is secondary for them in terms of what they're supposed to do. So how can we find some room to do some wiggle room?
Yeah, exactly. So, but how about we did not receive funding? What we're supposed to do, Judith?
Yeah, so actually currently in this situation where I feel like it's really hard and wrong to talk up this huge project, like apply for funding, and then you don't get it and you're like, bye. Oh, I was right there with you then. It's on the chat. So what I did was, before even putting in the grant, I said to the organizations, like, this is a topic I'm dedicated to. This isn't just like, oh, this happens to fit in this particular, like, you know, call for research for funding. This is something I want to pursue in some capacity. It may mean that I need to cut back. It may be that we need to shape it a little differently, but the heart of it will stay the same. So my next steps actually to reach out to these 9 organizations is actually to say, there are some possible funding mechanisms that we could pursue, right? You're willing to provide support for those. I want to tell you about these and which ones feel right for you in terms of pursuing that, right? Because they have their own research collaborations with other people. Are there any ways that we could tie into some other collaboration and maybe get some money for that and see what happens? Sometimes I've found that organizations are actually able to apply for money I can't get that actually goes toward a particular topic. Or it could be there's already an initiative that's happening somewhere and they might pull you in to do that. So I feel like to walk away basically makes it seem like, well, this question was important to all. So is it so important you can't just walk away and say it's not, but rather to persist and continue to kind of figure out funding before we do that. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I totally
Yeah.
agree. Sometimes if we apply, we did not receive fundings, and just like Judith say, sometimes community-based organizations might have other network, and sometimes it could be geographic locations. Certain funder really interest on very specific topic, and on our end, in the past it did happen, and then we approach the researcher and say, hey, this is the area we will be receive funding. We will be interested to partner with us, and let's talk it through the process together.
Yeah, I actually had I was at one point I worked for a different community organization, and they also wanted to do a program evaluation. That's my secondary interest, but we had no money, and so I was very upfront about like, okay, if you needed this to happen, like you need to like one, pay me, and two, you need to be able to provide incentives to all the people participating. And so they then approached, I'm going to give the Boston Foundation a shout out because they do a lot of great work. And they said to them, we want to do this, but we don't have the funding for that. And Boston Foundation said, here's some money, right? Like, just let us know what's going on. So that can happen as well. In the actual, when you're actually looking for funding, you might find it in different places. Last thing I found is I tend to tell people at my school what's going on for community-based stuff. I'm luckily at a place where they really value that work. And sometimes there may be internal funding that may arise that could help start a project in terms of like asking for it or something. And it helps to show, I think, to organizations that you're like committed to finding some way of making this work, because I'm sure they've heard people say that before and they're like, okay, we didn't hear from them ever again. So like, why should we trust the next researcher that's actually showing up?
Yeah, so that's a good point. Let's move to the implementations and analyze the findings and disseminations the study. So Judith, how do you determine like which voice are represented and what happened when you disagree?
So I have both stories. So one is with the, of course, de-identified data, depending on the role of our partner, right? If the partner chose to like not be involved in the analysis, but wanted to know about the findings, that's something that we would share with them and discuss them to make sure that they're, one, important findings, and two, that they're actually shareable. I actually had one incident where I was having a research team meeting, and my RAs, 3 of them are actually Chinese immigrants. And so I thought this one particular point was so interesting that it was so important. And they were like, it is not important, right? And I was like, but no, like, come on, like, what about this? Or like, you might think so, but it's really not that big a deal, right? So we ended up talking for a half an hour, in which afterwards I caved in and said, okay, you're right. Like, this is not a good point. I thought it was important, but from my perspective, my theoretical doesn't mean that the meaning I make of it is the meaning that the participants or you would make of that. So that's really important to understand and say. I think the other part is like, in determining the voices that were represented, like, I think just because people aren't part of the, are not able to be part of the research project doesn't mean they don't have a voice in how things are communicated. So providing spaces in which you can do workshops, presentations, there's these briefs, right? And or inviting organizations to be able to hear it. So for this particular grant that I was looking into, I said to organizations like, look, when we have all the data, we will have an open forum where anybody who's interested in this, parents, children, community organizations, can show up and discuss what should be used with this data, right? Because their ideas are what's going to really influence the community and its context in terms of addressing things like structural racism. I think the last thing that I'm thinking about is like, always I specify their different needs for dissemination. So I did a pilot study earlier this year, and this is where I interviewed some community partners about structural racism and mental health. And I asked them if they want to do a paper. And so 2 said they were. And then as they were doing that, they were like, can we have dissemination that's meaningful to our community? I'm like, yes, like that is built into this. So there will be an academic side of it, and then there will be briefs or whatever mechanism they think is meaningful to them that will help them in their work. That is actually what we will use. What about for you?
Yeah, so for community-based organizations, I think disseminate informations are very important. And I still remember like the parenting study result, we really want to educate like service providers as well as like state agency how to understand like AAPI or Asian American families, their need and also parenting. And so I think collaborate with a researcher to hold a disseminations of forums, involve all the stakeholders, partner is very important. And sometimes we also invite a community member so they could hear what is the outcome of the research project. And I remember one of the example, we just did a report on Asian care research project related to gambling preventions and interventions. And we not only invite the community member to hear the result, provide language access. So we have interpreter in the room, but also we invite the mass gaming commissions in the room to hear community voice. And I think that recommendations become very actionable. And after that launch, and I remember the commissioner requests to address those recommendations and write white paper. So that was very well received in all different levels. So I think we pretty much cover our conversations here, Judith.
Yeah, I think we did. I think just one last point I wanted to point out is dissemination is like the end point, and it's important that you ask questions in the beginning, because it could be that if you didn't ask the right questions and you didn't have the right data, then the organizations and partners can't actually use it. So I remember for one of the things I asked, what data do you need? And what people said, we need data that is qualitative and quantitative in order to help us tell the story. And then they started listing off all the representatives they were going to give this information to. So because they knew who they needed to target to get things pushed through. So it's something to keep in mind when you're asking at the very beginning is and thinking about how it will actually end. But other than that, Lesta, I think you're right. And so we're going to kind of open it up to anybody have any questions. You've heard us gab on for quite some time. So hopefully we can hear your voices.
What a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for the questions. Yeah, this is wonderful. Yeah, please stay tuned to our channels and all kinds of things for announcements for our last workshop. We haven't scheduled that one yet, but we'll announce that shortly. And Judith, Yoyo, thank you so much for your time. Ajay, thank you so much for your questions as well. This is wonderful. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.